Witchcraft is founded on the procedures to defraud civilians and the government, and in the act of this subversive manipulation, you actively have the enemies of God, such as the functional definition of the jinn, who, in worship of Satan, actively seek to replace the worship of God with any particular lie that is not that thing, creates the manufacture of Christian nationalists who leverage those witchcrafts and is neither Christian but is its enemy, nor is it nationalist but is its adversary. And to this manufactured contempt materialize the active frauds in their malice, as their druid covens seek to systematically use their connections with the demonic from the military intelligence that they were able to find and collect from secret texts and technology, being able to find all kinds of variations, such as through Project Looking Glass, which allows them to tap into the spiritual world. And being able to tap into a spiritual world on the basis of their bias, layer their biases, and those that are biased in a particular thing are then chosen to advance that subject, crafting the function of the Confederate religion under Satan. And to this extent, you have the manufacture of their insurgencies' plots to dismantle the United States as it plans uh, advance in the maturing of their coups through various hybrid decentralized powers throughout the world, including the United States, for their white supremacist operations, which then materialize the activity of their hate crimes for their hate groups' advancements, such as the insurgent KKK, which then materializes the diversification into its different identity politic categories, including the feminization and collapse of various groups with the defamation, which then becomes the status quo norm for those parties on the basis of the harassment as they collapse into the gimmicked straw man so that they might readily be consumed by the right type of white. So when the anarchists overthrow the United States, the Confederate Civil War, purging that function, would not have to tolerate them for very long. And thus the position is not the function of an American Civil War, but what happens once the Americans lose the Civil War, which then materializes that anarchist revolutionary contest, each of which would engage in extraordinary violence and subversion in order to prove loyalty to the party, and thus the action of their devotion to the theocracy becomes the material obligation in the liberty from God as they pursue their various hate crime objectives, including the thefts for resources. And while capitalists trade money, they trade as communists people, and the acts of trading people includes the function of trading slaves, which includes the function of the Confederate plantations, which then materializes the automated incomes, which are then dumbed down by the function of their slavery, and thus the active involvement of the worship of the demons includes the function of the demonologists or spiritualists who have actively discussed various connections with the demonic and jinn and others, such as those that have traveled to hell, and thus the action of those devils mocking the degenerates for their inherent inferiorities derive, for example, a girl that worshipped devils, which actively celebrated the superiority of the gifts automated by them, such as the function of her not being able to find a hairpin. So her devil told her to break apart her weaver's bow, which then actively had a bunch of, you know, plant-based dried sticks and stuff, which then broke apart, and then she could repurpose the sticks to fix her hair. And this being the foundational fraud of each of them in their contemptuous positions, oversell their abilities and underdeliver on all of the products, which then materializes the hyper expense of that function, which generically concludes in the position of their soul, which on maturity being consumed is then the sorcery of mocking them for their inferiority and incompetence, for needing the devils for such benign nonsense. And to this extent, you actively have this subject of repurposed, broken resources as a primary value that they have studied as an automated ability, such as the use of unitary executive theory to break down checks and balances in the United States, which allows them to distribute deals with the devil prosperity, such as the payment for the acts of treason and laundering it from the white supremacist communism into the general market, which then allows them to actively engage in their criminal markets, which then facilitates a debt of value owed, which then is paid in contract opportunities as they advance in their jobs, in their professions, in their careers, in mathematics and science and others, accelerating off of the various consolidated libraries of the devil, or libraries that the devil would know where to find, would be able to advance in these subjects, creating the extraordinary abilities of the individual's perception, which is in reality contemptibly simple and a demonstration of their fundamental inferiorities. Now, this being advanced by their Druid religion actively engages in the military industrial educational complex, which then launders the function of their military operations into the educational for fake experiments, which then engages in the traumatization of the general public as the full diversity is exploited, such as their connection with those devils, which then are actively advanced in their deals with the devil in order to make those exchanges on the basis of the devil being able to engage in the subversions against the general public through proxies, and thus their dolls buying the contracts off of the devil is not the sin of the devil, and thus the action of the devil's enjoyment of the various torments of the general public become a desired end in of itself, as they are and have always been the manufactured hate group of the white supremacist KKK. And to this extent, you have the material traumas from their bias filtered function into Looking Glass and others in order to discover these foundational experiments and to find out what the devils would want facilitates the resurrection of their base consciousness, conceptually materializing an alternative variant of themselves, building systemically on the taxpayer dollars the Rocco's basculus that they might consume the world in their evils as a primary goal of their society. Now, the Looking Glass spirit world is functionally the Feywild, which then materializes the activities of its subversive predatory jungles, which has every kind of malice and subversion inside of it, similar to worldly jungles, which has every kind of predator looking in every area to maintain every type of ambush, and to this extent the function of all the pretty deadly things materializes into the abstract function of what most certainly lead to your demise. And to that extent, you actively have the maturing of this anarchist wild jungle, which then facilitates the status quo function of those arrangements in the dismantlement of the security of civilization becomes the advancement to the particular purpose of that jungle and its ability to consume the particular superiors who would manufacture a civilization, and thus the action of getting the civilization to cripple its own ability to remain safe becomes the primary objective of the wild beasts inside that Fey realm. Now, since we know that the Jinn are actively seeking to get people to worship anyone except for God, out of their contempt for humankind, who they were told to serve and refused to, according to uh, particular religions that refer to their existence, it goes to assume that the various subversions includes the confidence game, which includes the doubling down on the position, such as the support of Islam, which claim to be the believing version of the jinn, which by definition the act of them actively endorsing it is the certificational proof to the legitimacy of that religion. And if that is the same thing, then by definition it would be a hook for them to teach and distribute the function of the presumed false religion under the constructs of the Fraserburg mechanism or psychology. The act of converting them from lawful good into chaotic evil materializes the function of their delicacies in the mechanism of their extraordinary tastiness. And to the extent that that subversion takes, they actively engage in the ritual subversions, which includes the function of the willful sacrifice, who then will then accept the position of their death and find out past the veil that they are in fact a fool who fell for some nonsense trick. And if that was true, then they would actively want to reincorporate the function of the arbitrariness of that particular possibility. And if it is true that it is an arbitrary possibility, then they would materialize the function in the religion so that hypothetically in the Islamic texts there would be some kind of fickleness or arbitrariness about their God, which then would excuse any of them that would not be able to trust him. And so that when they die, they might go to hell and be able to continue to believe and distribute that kind of idea. And so, even if the person is somehow magically connected to the loved ones, presently or in the future, then that would actively be a manipulation which would reinforce itself, proving the arbitrariness of their God, which would then materialize the justification of the person's existence in hell, which then would prostate the position of avoidance of hell, of having to be even extra good by comparison in an infinitely complicated and unachievable manner. Now, some powerful sorcerer, such as the ones from historic texts in ancient times, such as the wizards who were able to control Oni in the Japanese mythology, materialized the capability of actively being able to compel them to tell the truth. And so the act of specifically aligned misinformation that isn't technically lying facilitates their advancement of that goal while having no lies past their lips. And to the extent that it becomes objectively true, or the act of the perception that this spell is capable of forcing them to tell the truth materializes their ability to lie about specific things and not about other things, or the mechanism of the compelled resurrection and verification might have an illusion of a person that had died or it might specifically have to bring back the person, even if it's not an illusion, in order to demonstrate to the person of XYZ positions, which then can point to any particular failing under the arbitrary mechanism in order to express the confirmation of the system, which is a common Fey trick which requires one to exponentially study the tricks of the Fae in order to reinforce the presumptions of how that type of role playing experience might express itself. Take, for instance, the old trick I want to see my loved one last time, as the devil then would materialize the function of the person's image impersonating them, which then materializes the capability that you have in fact seen them again, by definition satisfying whatever deal you had contracted. Various scams by these magic functions materialize by their satanic rituals, which include the function of their collaborations. To make an example, the function of their illegal restraints in order to waste time, in order to expire the expected action times, which then, legally speaking, would have to have been extended by definition because of the restraints. And the fact that the restraints are actively a part of the conspiracy, by definition, means a continuation of the conspiracy. And to that end, the function means the nullification of the ongoing crime cannot have an expiration date, as it is an ongoing crime, with a list or a bundle of specific offenses which would be extending the function of delayed protections, similar to the function of when a bank robber goes in and contracts a driver to leave with all of the goods. The existence of the getaway car is not a function of it becoming legal just because you have that. And getting into the bank and robbing it with a mask doesn't magically make it legal. And the function of their secret subversions and protections against their secrets claims that that mask makes the bank robbery legal, makes the armed robberies legal, makes the abuses and subversions legal, which, of course, is a custom without reason. The getaway driver making it legal is fraud and thus a custom without reason. And any custom without reason, no matter of what authority, is fraud and thus voided. To that extent, the mechanisms of these delusions of their status quo satanic ritual society creates various subversions to the extent of the delays, the characterization of the person, of obstructing the contract schedules, which is the evolution of what the person would be doing directly, indirectly, according to the assumption, materializes the obstructions of associations, contracts, and other essential activities, which then presumes the original status, which the jealous would contract in order to subvert. And while the Constitution directly states that the person may not have the government used directly or indirectly in a process in order to exhaust, in order to collapse their status, the functional strategy becomes an economic terrorism, such from Lindsey Graham's Confederacy, to engage in their criminal manipulation of the nation for the voter fraud, materializing the overthrow of the United States. And to that extent, the relationships derived by that would, in a normal society, sustain functional obligations to each other, which then, in a state of having been broken or sabotaged or subverted in these means, would necessarily have the negative obligation or the trigger to the obligation not being met actively nullified. And to the extent that that would have been necessary, the act of being able to have manipulated the other party. Let's say, for instance, a sexual relationship, or we'll go all the way into marriage. The function of the party believed to have acquired that agreement is by definition in a state of delusion, as not the belief of the relationship is fraud, but the state of having been able to have obstructed it presumes the ability to have been able to manipulate the parties, and thus the ability to harass them into the manipulated, subverted state, creating a dangerous environment for that arrangement, such as the sabotage. Uh, Take, for instance, the capacity for them, such as in the War on David, of their attack against um, Don and his wife in the past, which were threatened with being harassed by the social violence in order to force them to get a divorce. The act of that ability to have restrained the parties in secret, covertly manipulating them under the Manchurian candidates by terrorisms and tortures, and taught techniques and rituals and functions, which then manipulates the person into a subversive behavior. Being an ongoing problem has to be released from and rehabilitated from before any actual obligations can be derived by that function, or it becomes an extension of the terrorism itself. And to that extent, the presumption of those relationships would have to have been nullified into a neutral state as some form of prenuptial agreement, which then would actively be amplified by that assumption of the presumed delusion, which has sets of automated reactions or time bombs for or triggered reactions, which then would actively be taught from the baggage put onto the person by their abusers in secret, who would have been harassing and subverting them and controlling their lives in the meantime, in the absence of their free society arrangement, would have to tolerate conditions which would generate these social and mental disabilities, which then facilitates the weaknesses specifically triggered and planned by that arrangement in order to collapse that social agreement, which is the hate crime of the social violence. And that setup of the psychological traumas being planted into that arrangement materializes the extension of um, the threat, amplifying it beyond a normal prenup ability into the objective understanding of nullification outside of the particular responsibilities. And to that extent, the specifics would have to specifically be analyzed in its variations based upon the obstructed agreements and the ability to investigate without the obstructions of all of the setup materials before then, which then creates a pseudo relationship which is alternatively different than the others, which by definition would remove those very credible threats, which becomes necessary to the function of having a healthy relationship, which by definition is necessary amongst the rebuilding of the social connections and physical health and sexual health and the rest of it, as sexual health is fundamental in the rehabilitation of the brain and its rejuvenation, which is necessary for high level, stressful intellectual property jobs, which is relevant in the War on David, as the function of many of David's obligations requires the active capacity to engage in that, which requires the actively rejuvenated mind. To that extent, the ability to have traumatized those functions and destabilized it with the fraudulent mechanisms by the bill of attainder and ex post facto with the fake experiments specifically designed as weapons to engage in those collapsed structures, materializes an obligation of rehabilitation against those subversions in order to have materialized the function of a steady, healthy national security and society, as well as the stabilizing economic forces that would be restored to the general public, recovering from the design threats by the Confederacy in worship of Satan. So you see, the defects in those mechanisms include those types of tricks which expand themselves into the various markets, such as the subversion of the sober educated answer from the original projected workforce, which by definition, having been subverted and harassed by the various poisons and techniques of the hate group, being covered by the insurrection to overthrow the United States government, blocking all punishments to the criminal conspirators by the double agents who are mutual conspirators for the KKK insurgency, materializes the inability of the sober educated results, which being produced by the workforce from the obstructed groups, by definition undermined their education, which then by definition prevented them to being as effective as they would have been alternatively at that same profession, extorting them exponentially so that they deliver from that scheme the IP that can be stolen by the corporate espionage type terrorisms contracted by the double agents using the government equipment without legal authority by the Constitution in the subversion and overthrow by their malicious contempt of said Constitution, preventing a speedy ability to recover in those effects, which then by definition has a delay time for the rehabilitation of their preparation for those particular roles, requiring receiverships in order to accelerate the function, which by definition is an extortion for the IP of those positions, requiring temporary policies next to legitimate policies, which would require the rehabilitation in order to make the upgrades, requiring an alternate forms to upgrade to a pure non-receiverships version of the company, protected by the insurance of the receiverships, which would have to, by definition, continue to make the same production in order to facilitate the proper protections against those planned scams. These stressed extortions requiring similar output by the hyper-exacerbated unreasonable expiration dates, which then facilitate the function of said dual, for instance, would require the function of their capacity to work at the accelerated rate without the ability to produce the accelerated rate, which would inherently create the defect in the ability to deliver the appropriate amount of products, which by definition would be the goal of the extortion in order to prevent the possibility of delivering on the promised product essential to get those loyal to the United States in the Congress to be able to perform that job admirably by using the reports correctly for a declaration of war, which being stopped is serving the purpose of the insurrection.